There are lots of theories of how the policymaking process works or should work, but I want to focus in this lecture on two dominant ones: the stages model, which is what you're looking at here, and the multiple streams model, which I'll talk about shortly. As you can see here, this model envisions policymaking as a progression from stage to stage. This thinks of policymaking as linear and logical. It's assumed to be mostly rational, predictable, and incremental. In this world, problems lead eventually to solutions. And as you can see here, they move from the pre-decision stage to the decision stage to the post-decision stage. So let's take each of these in turn. So let's look at stage one problem definition. There are many social conditions in the world at any given moment, but not all of them become defined as problems that political and policymaking systems seek to solve. So let me give you a concrete example. I live in the Washington Heights neighborhood of New York City, and it's a historically Puerto Rican and Dominican neighborhood. During the summer, people tend to gather on the streets and the sidewalks, sometimes until fairly late, often playing music. They set up tables and play dominoes. They bring little grills out and barbecue. They'll set up little tiny pools, right? This becomes really well-used public space. And this has been true for decades and decades, and was not understood to be a problem, right? But with gentrification, more people who don't have shared histories of that kind of street culture moved in. And they started to make complaints to the police and the community board about the noise or about blocking access. They made that condition into a problem, right? The behavior didn't change, the reality didn't change, but it became identified as a problem by people with more power, or certainly more perceived power. Another way to say this is that problems are socially constructed. And each of them can wind up being defined in all kinds of different ways. So one of the tricks is to learn to be attuned to those acts of construction. The key is not just what people are asking you to think about, but how they're asking you to think about it. So some examples, right? If we think about drug use, right? What kind of problem is that? Is it a problem of law enforcement? Is it a problem of public health? Is it a problem of educating people? Is it a problem of poverty and unemployment? Is it not a problem at all? Or if we think differently, right, if we define welfare as the problem, well, that leads us to a solution to maybe cut aid. But if we define poverty as the problem, the solution may be to expand aid. Right? The way in which a problem gets defined has a lot to do with what kind of proposals are going to arrive on the agenda and what form that policy formation or policy design will take. Here's another example of how problem is defined shapes the kinds of solutions or designs that will be proposed, right? We take homelessness here as an example. If we define that as a public nuisance problem, well, maybe the answer is to bring in the police and clear people off of public walkways. If instead we think of it as a problem of unsafe shelters, well, maybe we need more screening or regulation, or we build safer homeless shelters. If instead we identify it as a problem of rent burdens, cost of housing is too high, well, then maybe the solution leads us to rent subsidies or rent control or expanding the mortgage deduction. If instead we say it's a problem of a lack of available jobs or a lack of education and training to get those jobs, well, then maybe the solution is training or GED programs or college, right? And finally, if we identify it as the product of a disaster, a fire or a flood or a hurricane, well, then the solution may be, right, short-term intervention of the Red Cross to set up camps, right? As a political scientist, E. Schattschneider, you see here, said, "The definition of the alternatives is the supreme instrument of power." Don't sleep on this. Related to this, different groups are constructed differently in the political and public mind. And that may very well tell you something about what kind of power they are likely to have or not have. This is something we may want to touch on in class, and definitely something you want to think about for the policy areas that concern you. How are the objects of policy in your area constructed in the public mind or in policymakers' minds. Right? So pause this and look at the way in which Schneider and Ingram here have laid out these categories. Right? The folks that concern you, would they fall into the advantaged quadrant? Are they contenders? Are they dependents? Or are they deviants? All right, excuse me, let's move on to agenda setting. So once something gets defined as a problem, it has a chance of getting on the policy-making agenda. That means that people with the power to make change decide to consider making that change. Right? So who does that, and who has the power to get things on the agenda? Well, we're going to look at two theories of how we answer that question. The pluralist theory, right, tells us that the policymaking world is a relatively open one akin to a marketplace. Power is diffuse, it's spread across all kinds of different people, interests compete, and with government as the umpire to reconcile them, whoever has the best argument often is the one who will win, right? This also suggests that the who has power will vary from issue to issue, right? So the folks who have power and influence on housing issues are not the same people who are going to have power and influence on environmental issues, right? This is explicitly a Madisonian framework, right? James Madison, one of the principal authors of the Constitution. By contrast, elite theory tells us that power is concentrated, not diffuse, and that the system is relatively closed, not open. Or, again, in the words of Schattschneider, the pluralist choir sings with a strong upper-class accent. So what you're looking at here is from research by Martin Gillens, and it's consistent with what a whole bunch of others have found. So look at the left side there. What that's showing us is that the greater the share of high-income people who favor a particular policy change, the more likely it is to be enacted, right? Now, also looking at the left, the higher the share of low-income people who favor a particular change has no measurable effect on the likelihood it will get enacted. Now look at the right side, right? Same thing, the higher share of high-income people who favor a particular policy change, the more likely it was to be enacted. Now look at the blue line there. The higher the share of middle-income people who favor a particular policy change also has no measurable impact. Elite theory, in lots of instances, seems better supported by the evidence, and we will wade into more of that down the road. Now, this is not to say that other groups don't ever get policy change that benefits them. It's just to say that the obstacles for them are generally greater. It's a useful thing, I think, to keep in mind. So next we get to policy development or policy formulation or policy design, right? This is the act of creating proposed solutions. It's a new law or a regulation or internal policy and practices, right? And this is undertaken within the bureaucracy by think tanks, by experts, by university professors, by interest groups, by legislators, by states, by the Congressional Budget Office, right? All kinds of folks are engaged in policy design. Policy adoption or legitimation is next. And this is where we formalize the design and we make it real. You can't see me, but I'm putting real in air quotes there. So this is passing a bill, or finally formally adopting a new rule in an agency, or a court issuing an opinion. Next, we get to implementation. And this is where that new policy is carried out. And that can also take place in different locations, right? Maybe it's in an executive agency or by a state government or by a local one or within a corporation that's subject to new regulations and so on. So this is looking at a particular instance of implementation. This is the Medicaid expansion associated with the Affordable Care Act. And you see that those orange states are those that have not yet chosen to expand access to their Medicaid program, right? This points to one of the complexities that was highlighted in the previous lecture, right? The sheer complexity of the U.S. policymaking system. And one of the things that we're seeing here is the consequences of federalism, right? In almost any other nation, right, the national legislative body enacts a law. It applies pretty much equitably across the board to everyone, regardless of where in that nation they live. That is not true in the United States. And we regularly see widespread variation across all kinds of issues, from state to state to state, and even within states sometimes from county to county or city to city. All right, let's talk just a little bit about policy evaluation, right? And this is asking, how'd we do? Right, after a suitable amount of time has expired, ideally you undertake a systematic, a rigorous, and intellectually honest search to understand whether the goals of the policy that you enacted were actually achieved, and if not, why not? All right, so there are lots of critiques of this policy stages or stages heuristic model. That it's not descriptive in practice of how things actually happen in the real world, that it fails to account for policy feedbacks, which we're going to spend some time talking about down the road, that it's unverifiable, and the list does in fact go on. There is, I think, something to those critiques, but I also think it's useful as a way to organize your thinking about effective policymaking. But there's another way to think about this, and this is that second model. John Kingdon writes about a policymaking world in which instead of problems leading to solutions, solutions actually lead to problems. This is the multiple streams model. It goes like this. Right, so there are three streams operating independently all the time, he says. Politics, problems, and solutions or policies. In the politics stream, right, that's the ordinary allocation of power. Which party is in control of which branches, how large is their majority, who chairs which committee, what do they care about, and so on, right? So this is a reality all the time, regardless of your policy preferences, and it's one that's also always in flux. The problem stream contains the things that are drawing people's attention at any given moment, right? So after September 11th, terrorism was central in the problem stream. After a school shooting, often gun safety is in the problem stream. In 2020, right, it was the coronavirus pandemic that was the problem that people were paying attention to. And then finally, there's the policy stream or the solution stream. And these are the things that people want to achieve regardless of who is in power or whatever problem is drawing attention. In every office in Washington, D.C., there's a shelf full of white papers and policy briefs and proposals, and every advocate and lobbyist is always carrying around, often metaphorically but sometimes literally, a bill or a regulation that they want to see enacted, right? Everybody is usually working on achieving their one or two specific goals. So what Kingdon says is that policy gets made when first a policy window opens, when some event, usually, draws everyone's attention to something in particular. And then a policy entrepreneur can take advantage of that and push their preferred policy solution through the window, right? Or he or she joins the streams. Here's the key point. The policy doesn't emerge logically from the problem. The problem becomes the excuse to enact the policy, the same policy that people always want, right? So here's an example from Kingdon's book, right? Mass transit is a preferred solution, a policy goal of a number of people, right? In the 60s, they argued that you need more mass transit because it was a solution to an environmental problem. In the 70s, they argued still for more mass transit, right? Only this time they argued it was a solution to the oil shortage, energy crisis, and foreign fuel dependence. In the 1980s, they were still arguing for mass transit, but instead then said, well, it's going to be a good solution to urban congestion. And as we move more into the recent period, people are still arguing for mass transit, right? Now they're arguing that it's the solution for global warming, right? So the process is not rational in that way, and it's not incremental necessarily. Solutions seek problems. So here's a real-world example from a New York Times article about post-September 11th policymaking, which you can pause and read. But what you'll see here is that everyone was trying to reframe the policy change they wanted, the policy change they always want, as an anti-terrorism policy. And many of them succeeded, it's worth pointing out. So in sum, it's complex and it's messy and it's contingent and it's often unpredictable, and that, by the way, is true whichever of these models you latch onto. But there are ways to overcome those things, which is in part what we're going to explore throughout this course.